As you know, we've noticed the same things you've noticed out there in the real world. We've all noticed that things seem to keep getting more expensive by the day. We thought as a department we would try to put a little structure on that and understand that a little bit better ourselves, and communicate some of that to the folks out there in the state of Ohio and throughout the country. So over the next 5 months, we're going to sort of take a deeper look at a number of different sort of market segments and market sectors in the U.S. and globally. Those include food today, agricultural commodities, trade, labor, energy, as well as overall inflationary trends. So we invite you to join us in those. They're basically on a monthly basis. This one got pushed into February, so we're going to have 2 in the month of February. We'll talk a little bit more about that and present the whole schedule to you towards the end. So without further ado, though, I'd like to welcome today Dr. Zoë Plakias, who is an agricultural and food systems economist and a faculty member in our department, the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. She studies the decisions of farmers, consumers, and policymakers and other food system stakeholders and the impacts of those decisions on society. She also teaches in the department's undergraduate and graduate programs. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zoë. Zoë, thanks for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brent and Holly, for putting this together. And thank you for everyone who is joining from as far away as Georgia, it appears, from the chat, Georgia, the country. So really glad to have you here today. And I really also encourage you, as others have said, to join us for our other series moving forward. And also, if you find this later in terms of the recording and aren't joining us live today, I'm really glad you found this webinar online. So without further ado, I want to jump into a topic that I think is top of mind for all of us right now, which is the price of putting food on the table and consumer food prices and inflation. So our agenda for the talk today is this. First, what do we know is happening with food prices? Second, why is it happening, or why do we think it's happening? Third, who is it impacting and how is it impacting them? Then what could happen? And we'll wrap up with a couple of thoughts of what we can do about it. So first, what is happening with food prices? What you'll see here is the consumer price index for the last 5 years. The blue line is food at home. So this is food that you would purchase at the grocery store and then eat at home. And then the red line is food away from home. So this would be food you would eat out at a restaurant if you are doing that these days. So these numbers are from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Okay, and we see that consumer food prices are increasing. Now, also just to kind of highlight some of the things happening on this graph, we see that the blue line has a little bump up in early 2020, right? This is when we were shifting pretty dramatically to food at home during the lockdowns at the early part of the pandemic. And also you see there's the gray bar. The gray vertical bar represents US recessions. And so we saw a recession in early 2020. So what you'll see is that there's been this increase occurring over time. And in fact, this increase in food prices is normal. So I do want to highlight that. But the current price increases are faster than normal. So if we look at a longer time series, that the previous graph was 5 years. If we go back and we look, this graph starts in the 1950s, we see that, well, prices have been increasing over time and some level of inflation is normal. I've circled that area right now, right, 2020, 2021, and we see that that line has gotten pretty steep. And so it's not that there's the positive kind of slope that's a concern, it's how steep that slope is in particular that's of concern right now. And you can see there are additional gray bars that are highlighted here. So these are additional recessions over time since the 1950s. Now, the reason that this is a problem in particular, that we have faster than normal inflation, is that economic adjustments, for example, wage increases, cost of living adjustments, et cetera, may not be able to keep pace with the price increases. So we know that over time, we do see that the prices that we see at the store increases, but our income and wages tend to increase over time as well. And it's kind of the balance between these two that determines whether or not our purchasing power is increasing or decreasing. So again, it's the speed of this inflation that is really the concern right now. So some definitions that I just want to go over because this can be a little confusing is that inflation is an increase in price levels over time. Now, deflation is a decrease in price levels over time. So if we go back to this graph, right, any slope where you have a positive slope, so any place where you see the red and blue lines going up and to the right is going to be some level of inflation. Deflation would be if the red or the blue lines were going down and to the right. So we'd actually see a decrease in price levels. A decrease or decline in inflation is not the same as deflation. So a decrease or decline in inflation, again, going back, would be maybe a positive slope. So the line still going up and to the right, but somewhat flatter. Whereas an increase in inflation would be when that line gets somewhat steeper, okay? So really we're talking about that speed of inflation or the slope of the red and the blue lines. So now I want to dig in a little bit to the specific food prices and that we've seen in 2021. Okay, so what we see here, my apologies, is we see food price inflation increased in 2020, but we actually saw some declines in inflation in 2021 relative to 2020. So these bars, okay, are showing the light pink 2019, the bright red 2020, and the dark red 2021. These are USDA data that were recently published by the Economic Research Service. And you see the vertical axis is showing the annual % change in retail price, and the horizontal axis is showing these different categories of foods. So the fact that the bright red is higher than the pink across the board means that in 2020 relative to 2019, we did see higher rates of inflation. This is not surprising because this is when we saw the onset of the pandemic. However, you'll see that in some cases, the dark red bar, which represents 2021, is higher than the bright red bar. And in some places, it's actually lower than the bright red bar. So what this shows us is that when the dark red bar is higher, it means that in 2021, the rate of inflation was higher for this food category. So we see this for meats, poultry, and fish. We see this for fats and oils, eggs, and fruits and vegetables. But for the other, and for cereals and bakery products, excuse me. But for the other 4 categories, so sugar and sweets, non-alcoholic beverages, other foods, and dairy products, we actually see that inflation rates in 2021 were lower than 2020. Now, again, that still means that prices were increasing, just not as fast as they had in 2020. Now, if we then look within the meats category, which is definitely a place where we've had a lot of concern and we've seen a lot of attention paid to the meat supply chain, we do see that the food price inflation for meat categories was relatively high. Especially we have seen this for beef and veal, okay, which we see up in the 8 to 10% range there on the left. And we saw this for pork as well. And even for fish and seafood and poultry, these are relatively high levels of price change over time. Now, what you do see also, though, is that for beef and veal, at least 2021, we saw still quite high, but lower levels of inflation than we saw in 2020. However, we see for pork and seafood, the inflation rates were higher in 2021 than 2020. Now, what this may indicate is that when people were either seeing that they were not seeing beef and veal on their store shelves because of stockouts, or if they were seeing the prices were high for those meats, they may have substituted away from beef and veal to pork and fish and seafood, which might be why we're seeing some of those increases. Now, if we look instead in the fruit and vegetable category, so this again is a kind of breaking down the fruit and vegetable category on the larger graph, we see that food price inflation for all but fresh vegetables increased in 2020, and we saw some declines in 2021. So for fresh vegetables, right, at the onset of the pandemic, people were really moving toward purchasing of shelf-stable foods. There was a concern about how long the lockdown would last. And so things like fresh vegetables, which were more likely to spoil quickly, were something that folks were buying less of. They're more likely to buy processed fruits and vegetables, canned, frozen, et cetera. So that's likely why we're seeing what we're seeing here. And then fresh vegetables were the only category for which we saw a food price inflation decline in 2021 relative to 2020 for all of the categories that I'm looking at. Okay, so we know food prices are increasing. Not only do we have these graphs that I've just shown you, but we are all probably seeing this in our daily lives in the stores. So why is this happening? Well, if you take my Principles of Food and Resource Economics class, I'll show you a graph something like this. This is a simplistic representation of what's going on, but I think it highlights some of the key factors and why things are particularly challenging right now. So on the horizontal axis here, we have the quantity of any particular food item. And on the vertical axis, we have the price. Now, without any of the kind of challenges we're seeing related to demand and supply, you see that we have say a pre-pandemic demand of D1 and a pre-pandemic supply of S1. Now, there are factors affecting both demand and supply right now during the pandemic. So let's first look at supply. You see that I have a dashed line labeled S2, right? This is a shift in supply, contraction of supply. Now, what might be causing this? One is higher input costs, intermediate inputs, raw materials, et cetera, across the board. One of those input costs for many folks is wages, right? Because labor is an input into all of our food products. So we see higher wages can lead to higher costs, higher input costs for producers. In addition, we have continued worker illness, and worker illness not only in food production, processing, and distribution and retail, but also contributing to transport delays, for example, in trucking. At the same time, we've seen a shift from D1 to the dashed line D2. So these are the demand shifters that could cause this kind of shift would be increased consumer spending due to maybe consumer optimism as we've cautiously kind of come out of the pandemic, higher wages. So on this side, right, higher wages for laborers, of course, means that those laborers can then turn around and can spend those wages, right? So higher wages can lead to higher spending. And then, of course, government spending. So fiscal stimulus, right, which is spending by the government, then also can contribute to this demand. So what this means is that whereas pre-pandemic, we might have been at the price level of P1, and with just the demand shifts, we would be at a price level of P2, or just the supply shifts, we would be at a price level of P3. We have the demand and the supply shifts compounding, and all of them are pushing prices up, right? So we see that that takes us from that price level of P1 all the way up to that price level of P4, okay? So this is essentially what is happening in many of our supply chains. Okay, now let's think about supply. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to make a Groundhog Day reference because today is Groundhog Day. In fact, we were just looking it up beforehand. We see that Punxsutawney Phil predicts that we will have 6 more weeks of winter. Apparently, Buckeye Chuck disagrees, so there's a little bit of a groundhog standoff there. But if we follow Punxsutawney Phil, then 6 more weeks of winter, and of course, we have a storm coming in tonight for those in the Ohio area. So the metaphor actually works here for Groundhog Day. If you haven't seen this classic 1993 Bill Murray film, it's a fun one. So Bill Murray is a newscaster. Okay, he goes to Pennsylvania to report about whether or not Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, and then he begins repeating the same day over and over and over again. So gosh, doesn't this feel a lot like the variants that we're seeing for COVID? The Omicron variant, right? We thought we were done after Delta. Actually, we thought we were done before Delta, and then we had Delta, and now we thought we were done again. Then there was Omicron. So just like Bill Murray waking up at 6 a.m., starting the same day over with the same Sonny and Cher song, right? We have variant after variant that we have been seeing, and this has really been a challenge. And of course, it makes us feel like Bill Murray there at the bottom at the cafe, looking pretty dejected there with Andie MacDowell, pretty bummed out that we're dealing with another variant. Now, also, if we extend the metaphor a little bit, the story goes in the film that Bill Murray lives this day over and over and over again. And finally, he realizes he has the opportunity to kind of turn his life around. So we have the opportunity with each variant to respond in a better way. And hopefully we can have the same happy ending as Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell. Okay, now why is Omicron important? Well, if you saw me give a talk, or basically any talk during the pandemic, what I've been saying is every part of the supply chain with humans has been impacted by COVID, right? And so I put a check mark next to literally every part of the supply chain here, because the impacts at each portion of the supply chain then kind of compound all of those issues, right? Leading to the supply issues that I highlighted. Now, in particular, if we look at what this means in terms of the supply of food in the United States, right? I wanted to highlight something that, again, I brought up in my November Outlook talk. So the graph on the left is the November 2021 graph, and this is using data from a dashboard that Purdue University has developed, and you can link to it with the hyperlink below. And this dashboard shows vulnerable production based on COVID positivity rates in worker populations and in the region around food processing facilities. So in November 2021, we see that this is the US total vulnerable production for the last 30 days. So that was looking 30 days prior to the November 2021 talk that I gave. And so we see that things are in the order of magnitude that the largest, right, is about $350 million. If we look to February 2022, and I just pulled these numbers this morning, we see that we have an order of magnitude more in terms of the value of total vulnerable production in the last 30 days. And that is most definitely driven by the high transmissibility of the Omicron variant. Okay, so this is continuing to create challenges in our food supply chains. At the same time, if we think about what's impacting demand, we see that consumer optimism is driving cautious kind of increases in consumer spending. So this is from a McKinsey and Company report from late 2021, so before the Omicron variant took off. And we do see that there was overall optimism about economic recovery that was continuing to slowly increase in 2021. So the blue bar, which indicates optimism that the economy will rebound, became larger and larger and larger over the course of 2021. So what this means is that this might cause us to, this optimism, right, might cause us to kind of try to return to some semblance of normal and normal spending as we move forward. Now, at the same time, as I said, wage increases and getting back to work can fuel increases in consumer demand, because although wages are a cost to producers, wages are, of course, income to consumers and allow consumers to increase their spending. So this is, again, from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This is showing the average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory employees. And again, this is looking back 5 years. Now, you will note here that there's this kind of bump up in early 2020. This actually doesn't have to do with the fact that wages increased so much as it has to do with the fact that there were a lot of layoffs during this time. So lower wage workers were not working, and so that raised the average wage in the economy. So what we've seen is this continued wage growth, right? As employers are paying higher wages to draw workers in. And of course, this can also drive consumer demand. Okay, now let's talk about who is impacted by rising food prices and how they're impacted. The most affected group of people in the US here, which is the geographic area that we're looking at, of course, though this can be somewhat translatable to other places, is low-income people, right? Inflation is similar to a sales tax. It's regressive. So it affects the people who are spending the largest share of their income on these necessities. Folks who are low income spend a large share of their income on necessities like food and rent. They're also already more likely to be food insecure. So having to, at worst, skip meals, and at best, kind of sacrifice the quality of food that they purchase to meet their budget. So what inflation means for low-income folks is that they may have to actually decrease the quantity of food they purchase to stay within their budget. And this can really exacerbate that existing food insecurity. And folks are most vulnerable if they are not signed up for food assistance programs like the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, or WIC, the Women's, Infants, and Children Program, or other similar programs. Now, just to highlight what income level we're talking about here, SNAP eligibility for households is based on, unless there's a disabled individual in the household, households are eligible if their income is at or below $36,000 for a household of 4. So this is 130% of the 2022 federal poverty line for a household of 4, based on the recent numbers released by U.S. Health and Human Services just earlier this year. Now, middle income people, of course, above this level are also still affected. This group of people is a group of people that spends a smaller share of income on necessities. So again, that's food, rent, necessary purchases than low income people. However, they may have to purchase items that are less desirable to stay within their budget, okay? And this can be really concerning when we're not used to it. Also, based on their income, they're unlikely to qualify for food assistance programs like SNAP or WIC. And finally, the least affected group of people is likely to be high income people. So again, these are the group of people that spend the smallest share of their income on necessities like food and rent. And maybe they might forego buying luxury items for now by choice, but this generally isn't out of necessity. It may be just to save a little bit of money. Okay, now I also want to take a moment to just kind of talk about how food prices and stockouts are related. So what do I mean by stockout? I mean when certain items are temporarily missing from store shelves. And I really like to use the term stockout rather than food shortage, because I think food shortage can be a really scary term, right? So these stockouts, right, they're really driven by the same things that are driving price increases, and they can drive further price increases, right? So I talked about both the increased demand and the decreased supply and showed you a graph of how those could lead to increased prices. Now, increased demand and decreased supply can also lead to these stockouts at the grocery store, and retailers might respond to that by raising prices on the remaining items. So this can further exacerbate the price increases. So it's kind of a both and situation. So they're related, but they're not exactly the same. Okay, I just opened up the Q&A real quick because I saw that there were some things coming up here. I'm going to come back to these, I think, when we get to the end, but I'm really excited to see that there's some interest. So thank you so much. Okay, so next up, I think the big question mark, right, is what could happen to food prices in the future? So first of all, here's some possible scenarios for the economy. And this is from a very recent publication by the consulting firm Deloitte. And I thought this had kind of a nice summary. Well, not all the news is so nice, but a good kind of concise summary of some of the possible scenarios. So I kind of want to talk through these a little bit. And I, of course, if you're interested more in some of these kind of general inflation scenarios, I encourage you to come back for my colleague Mark Partridge's talk, where he's going to talk more about I think both the scenarios and the kind of policy responses. So the 4 scenarios here, first on the left, on the top is blue skies, right? So this suggests that current inflation the high rates of inflation would be temporary. We'd come back down to kind of a normal rate of inflation, and we'd see the supply chain disruptions really settle in 2020. Furthermore, this assumes consumer demand for services and goods rebalances. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that largely during the pandemic, folks have been purchasing more goods than services. Okay, and this is driving up prices for those goods. Also, as part of the scenario, labor supply stabilizes as individuals re-enter the workforce, and we do see an end to the pandemic, not just this false kind of end. And the Federal Reserve responds with limited and gradual interest rate increases. Now, I haven't mentioned the Federal Reserve yet, but the Federal Reserve, one of the main ways that we talk about addressing inflation at a federal level is with the Federal Reserve changing interest rates. Now, what raising the interest rate could do is it would make it more attractive for consumers to save, and this would maybe curb some of the demand side issues that we're seeing in the economy. Now, the Federal Reserve Board met last week. They decided not to raise interest rates, but there's a lot of folks that are anticipating that they may raise interest rates later this year. The downside of that can be that if they kind of overcorrect, then that can actually lead to recession, which we'll see in another example here. So let's move over to the sun showers example, which is the dark green on the top. And what we see is that inflation settles at kind of a higher than pre-pandemic levels through 2024, as we continue to see supply chain disruptions because of different variants of the virus, and the labor supply remains somewhat constrained. We see, adjustments in growth, but there are some winners and losers. So some industries do better than others. Here, consumer spending and economic activity remains stable, but we stay skewed towards goods. So we don't return to consuming as many services, and the Federal Reserve response is moderate. The worst case scenario here, I would say that Deloitte highlighted is a stormy weather scenario where we have much higher than normal inflation at rates of 8 to 9%. What this could lead to is this wage price spiral. As I indicated, wages are both an input, right, into they're an input cost, right, for producers. So when wages are increased, that may draw workers in, but producers may raise prices for their outputs because their input costs have increased. So the output costs would then increase. And of course, since consumers are also workers, consumers will demand higher wages to compensate for those price increases. And you can see how that can be this spiral. So here the supply chain issues deepened, exacerbated by new strains of COVID, and the Federal Reserve Board increases interest rates to put the brakes on inflation, but that does end up triggering recession. And then finally, the fourth situation is this downdraft, where we actually see disinflation as a result of faster than expected resolution of the supply chain disruptions, and as people spend down their pandemic savings. So if people had some savings and they've been spending a lot, kind of taking advantage of that savings, once that's spent down, maybe that kind of spending by consumers moderates. So we see low growth that lowers or that lowers corporate profits, and the Federal Reserve keeps those rates at historic lows. Now, it's always dangerous for an economist to make a prediction because there's a lot of uncertainty in this. I would say my view is the most likely scenario of these four is the sun showers. This is kind of middle of the road, right? So it's saying, yeah, we're still in a tough situation. And I want to note the year there through which we'll see supply chain disruptions is 2024. It's currently the beginning of 2022. So that's a long time. And that is, of course, not ideal, but I think that this is likely to continue for a while, but we will adjust. Nevertheless, there are going to be some folks who do well in the situation, some folks that continue to really struggle, and we need to consider that as we move forward. Now, I will also want to highlight some of the specific projections that have come out recently for specific foods. So these are the January USDA projections. They just came out last week, and they come out, I think, updated on a monthly basis. They suggest that inflation will continue for various foods except for eggs in 2021, but it will be lower in 2022 for most food categories. Now, what you're seeing here are these bars. They provide a range, right? They don't provide a point estimate. So you see, for example, meats, poultry, and fish is where we continue to see projections for the highest levels of inflation among all of the food categories. And this would be a 2.5 to 3.5 projected annual % change in retail price. So I've, of course, ordered these from the kind of highest levels, meats, poultry, and fish, sugar and sweets, to the lowest, which would be eggs. If we look within the meat category, the January USDA projection suggests that inflation will be lower in 2022 for most meat categories. So when you compare this to 9 and 10% kind of levels of inflation for 2021, this is good news, but these are still price increases, and so that is going to continue to those prices that we're seeing are continue to be high, right? They're not going down, but we're hoping that growth in prices will slow. That's the prediction. Again, beef and veal and pork are the highest levels. Poultry, fish and seafood, and other meats are a little bit lower. And then finally, the January USDA projections for fruits and vegetables suggests that processed fruits and vegetables are going to see the highest rates of inflation. Fresh vegetables will see higher rates of inflation than previously, but still not very high, and fresh fruits will be a little bit lower. Okay, so can we slow down inflation? Last week, there was a really interesting, I thought, Washington Post article, and you can link to the source there after Holly posts the slides. And you can see this was a variety of economic experts that were talking about their kind of strategies, their suggestions to the White House for ways to address inflation. And I wanted to highlight a couple of these and talk about them specifically in the context of the food supply chain and in the context of consumers. So first of all, this is Claudia Sam's suggestion, macroeconomist. She says, control the COVID pandemic. So, one of the things that she's talked about a lot in her discussions around inflation is that, even if the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, really that will only go so far when we continue to have COVID affecting our economy, right? Because it's not really addressing the source of the issue. So continued efforts to control the pandemic, okay, are ways that is actually, I think, a good strategy for working to address the supply side sources of inflation, right? So this means following CDC or local guidelines, right? Some local guidelines are more restrictive than the CDC, and encouraging and allowing workers to control transmission. What does that mean? That means that in some cases, workers are being forced to or strongly encouraged to return to work when they may have been exposed to COVID or something of that nature. And so that could potentially exacerbate transmission. So allowing people to stay home or encouraging them to stay home when they are ill can help to control transmission in the workplace. Helping workers get back to work. So another one of the ideas that was discussed in the context of this Washington Post article was this idea of investing in childcare. As I think anyone who is a parent of a young child or a school-aged child knows, there continue to be challenges with daycare and school closures consistently due to the COVID pandemic. So many workers are still impacted by these closures, and caregiving obligations are a major stressor and a major cause of absenteeism in the workplace. So investing in childcare on a variety of scales can help workers get back to work. Another important point here is innovation, right? We are all incredibly tired of the pandemic. We all would like it to end, and we all would like a return to some semblance of normal. However, the pandemic is continuing for now, and it's creating hopefully some opportunities for us to do some things differently. So look for opportunities to adapt new practices and new technologies. Embrace this idea of change, right? Change can be uncomfortable, but ultimately it can lead us to something better. And also I want to make the point that good ideas can come from anywhere. So we have a lot of workers, of employees who may not be at a management level, but who are on the front lines and are seeing what consumers need and can communicate those needs to managers. So consider, that those good ideas can come from anywhere, and listening to employees and taking their ideas to heart and maybe incorporating them can also be a great way to make employees feel valued, which is something that's really important right now as businesses are struggling to hire and retain employees. And then make expectations realistic. Again, we all want things to be over, but pretending that everything is good news, okay, is really not great for setting realistic expectations for consumers. So the good news is that some inflation is normal and expected, although we are operating at higher rates of inflation right now. Also, we're not running out of food. That is not the situation that we're facing. The bad news is recovery will be slow, and that some usual conveniences might not be available in the short term. And especially for those of us in the US who are used to having those usual conveniences and have the privilege of that on a regular basis, having to purchase something we wouldn't normally purchase, or not having something right where we want it, when we want it, is really something that can stress us out. Okay, and then finally, strategies for consumers. I would say keep calm and carry on, right? Again, we are not running out of food, but you may be required to adapt in ways that we haven't done in a long time, maybe ever. Unnecessary purchases like stockpiling and panic buying also can exacerbate the situation. So that there is that temptation when we get worried about what's happening with food to stockpile, but I encourage you to purchase just what you need. Utilize food assistance programs if you need them. Food assistance programs like SNAP, like WIC, they're there for a reason and can help if you qualify for them. There's wide academic evidence that they do increase food security. And continue to do your part to curb the pandemic. Ultimately, that is what is driving all of these impacts. So following CDC and local guidelines regarding vaccination, masking, and social distancing is ultimately going to be a huge way that we address inflation moving forward. And with that, I will stop and start addressing the many questions that we have. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Zoe. That was really, really fantastic. I guess we didn't talk about how you want to do this. I could ask the questions to you if that's okay. And then give you a little more conversational maybe for the people online. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So why don't you do that, Brent? And I also have the questions pulled up if I want to like read them at the same time. So, but if you wanted to kind of to just ask them, that would be great.
That's great. I did want to start out with my own question because I'm the moderator and I'm allowed to do that. Sorry, everybody. It's a really simple one though that Zoe will be able to easily ask or answer, I should say. Is this a global phenomenon? I mean, is this really? Are these prices just rising in the U.S. or are they rising around the world for people? And because there are, you made the point about what's happening with people who are relatively less well off, but around the world there are a lot of people who are less well off, and rising prices could really affect them in a really bad way. So is it global? Is it just us?
Yeah, I mean, COVID is everywhere, right? And so all of these, all of what we're seeing is happening around the world. Certainly it's impacting different people in different ways. There's, as we know, there's definitely a difference in vaccination rates around the world and a difference in COVID kind of positivity rates around the world. So there is a difference in how much this is impacting kind of different places. Largely richer, more developed countries have much higher vaccination rates because they have access to the vaccine, where we haven't seen that in lower income and less developed countries. Of course, people who are in lower income and less developed countries are more likely to be food insecure already. And so small changes in prices can kind of push people over the edge and really cause them, again, to go from what was maybe already a concerning situation to a very concerning situation in terms of food security. And I also want to mention the kind of weather issues. We are also seeing in some places, some of these issues can be exacerbated by, there's some historic droughts, there's conflict. For example, in Ethiopia, that is affecting folks' ability to get food. Here, we're going to have this storm that comes into Ohio in the next 24 hours. That's also going to be a factor. So yes, this is everywhere, and I think it's going to take a concerted effort by all of us to help to address it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting, and kind of I want to follow that up with Kathy Jackson's question on here, which I thought was super interesting about sort of the food sector and livable wages. I mean, it's an interesting point she raises there. I assume you're looking at the question, which is, what level of food cost growth should we expect to reach this equity, which is kind of, can some of this increase in prices work its way down to wages, right? So what's pushing what here? That's how I read this question. What's pushing what? Are rising prices pushing wages up, or are wages pushing prices up for food? And how does this affect the worker at the food plant?
Both. I mean, I think we're seeing both of those factors. Like I said, in the kind of wage price spiral, they can each affect the other because labor is an input into production. So I think that's it really can happen in both directions. But also, I think the point, if I understand your point, Kathy, here is also, if we really want to think about what this could mean, if we really want to ensure that workers are getting a higher wage, this would mean that this would drive up the prices of food that we pay as consumers, right? And so I don't know the specific answer to your question of what level of food cost growth should we expect, but this is really a central tension when we talk about the future of the food system, because there's been a lot of celebration of the fact that we are able to produce food relatively cheaply, and that this drives food security. But at the same time, there's been a recognition that that cheap food has a cost, right? And that cost can be poor working conditions and low wages for some of the people in our food system. So certainly, I think it takes looking at both. It's not as simple as let's just increase wages. And I think you've highlighted why, right? Because we need to also understand how that will impact prices. So I think that's a great topic for research, but I don't have the question right now to tell you what it would take to get there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, certainly as a question policymakers are going to be looking at them. I have to imagine.
Yeah.
You know, the interesting questions. I mean, Aria Rivera had a number of questions in there, and I wanted to start with the second two questions because I think they're similar, and you were hitting on them towards the end of your talk. You know, this question of stockouts, and that's kind of related to the discussion right there. Is that, you know, the question, as I understand from Aria, is, you know, stockouts can be related to supply chain deficiencies. If correct, is labor the cause for the nightmare? So, you know, is the real heart of this just the labor dilemma that we have? That is, you know, people are out with COVID, and there's COVID causing all kinds of supply chain issues, and et cetera, et cetera. That is that really the driver of all of this, you know, inflation in the food sector? But see, I see the relationship there that you talked about this, that there's lots of sort of other uncertainties that happen, say with weather and climate changes. And the next question from Maria is, you know, those are also having it. So are, you know, I guess just trying to push you to sort of be more definitive. What's really driving this? You know, I guess I want to hear.
I think, yeah, I mean, I'm fine, no problem in saying that COVID is driving this. I mean, I showed the graphic, right, where I put a check mark. You know, I went and I copied and pasted a check mark next to every piece of the supply chain.
Where's the biggest check mark?
No, well, the check mark is COVID, right? The check mark is COVID at every point, right? In terms of, if you're asking at which point in the supply chain is the biggest, I don't know that I could say that. And I'm not trying to like hedge. I just mean that it is truly the compounding, I believe, the compounding of the kind of labor challenges and the way that people are affected in kind of all points of their life by COVID, that is then, you know, it's affecting each place where humans are involved in the supply chain. And our supply chains, many of them these days are relatively long. And we have operated, I guess I'll also say that it's COVID on top of the kind of status quo design of our supply chain, which is that we've been operating in this kind of just-in-time environment previously, pre-pandemic, where there was a lot of efficiency, right? And we were working to move things very quickly through the supply chain and not hold a lot of inventory. And then there were a lot of people, though, that were kind of touching, figuratively speaking or literally speaking, touching a product in some stage before it got to us, between the farmer and the consumer. Right. And so when you have the situation of the pandemic, that design really doesn't work very well. And so what we've seen is, you know, I was reporting when I gave my talk in November that we were starting to see more inventory storage, right? Distributors were trying to hold inventory so that they would be able to have it and weren't relying on, you know, transportation schedules that have been kind of unreliable. And so we didn't have a supply chain that was particularly resilient to the challenges that we would face. And so we are seeing a lot of things that already were challenges and already were issues really laid bare by the pandemic and exacerbated by the pandemic. And climate change, of course, was already an issue before the pandemic, and it continues to be an issue during the pandemic as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. I was thinking that as well. I guess my recollection is that, you know, most of the food we eat, and this was kind of to your first two slides or so, is that, you know, so much of the food we eat is eaten out, and so labor is the big cost input in that. And then of what we eat at our homes, a lot of it, the input is partly labor, but more importantly, the plastic that we wrap it in, and the transportation it takes to get the food to us, rather than the cost of the actual food itself, right?
Right. There is going to be a different labor cost with that with that food away from home and restaurants, right, you have all the additional labor of the food preparation and the food service that is happening in those spaces. Though I would say, and I think that probably others have seen this, I have seen definitely an increase in automation during the pandemic, just kind of anecdotally, right, where I see more self-checkouts, more counter service only kind of restaurants, more takeout only restaurants, where they're not actually, hiring as many people, either because they can't or they're choosing not to.
Yeah, so if this really was just a function of just the food sector was the only sector, then we would expect to see a lot more innovation, a lot more changes in the food sector. But we'll probably expect to see those anyways, that we're going to see continuing adaptations to this sort of rise in prices. And we don't know exactly what those are going to be, but they're probably going to be along the lines of automation and ways of sort of removing labor from the from the equation.
Certainly, yeah, certainly one piece of the equation is that, and that is both. There's some pros and cons to that, which I want to highlight. Right, one is that many of these jobs that are now being shifted to automation, right? So moving from having more kind of checkers to that are humans that are checking you out, to having these kind of self-checkout machines. Those are relatively low wage jobs anyway, and might not have been jobs that people would hope to maybe stay in over time. So there's some bigger questions, I think, not just in the food sector, but in our economy as a whole, about the future of work. And if we do automate at this time, what are the things that people can go back to and can do instead as they go back to work? Can we create better jobs for people so that the jobs that they are going into are more desirable? And overall, I think that's kind of that sounds like a good story. Of course, that transition to that can be painful.
Yeah, so this, Subu, Kumarapan sort of asked in the chat, what types of resilience are being built into the supply chains with the lessons learned from the COVID-19 disruptions? And I think that's kind of, you talked a bit about those, but maybe you could talk a little more about that, because I think it's on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there's a couple of kind of different pathways for resilience, and frankly, there's not full agreement on what resilience is as a term, or what it means, or what it could mean for the food system. So that's a discussion topic that a lot of scholars and a lot of policymakers are kind of talking about right now. But you could think about within a company, right? You could think about resilience. So, you have firms that are saying, gosh, we've got to maybe plan on a different horizon, or we've got to look at things differently than we have before. We've got to, maybe it means a company's opening a new facility. For example, we just saw, Intel is making a massive multi-billion-dollar investment in Ohio, and that was announced last week. And in part, that is likely due to the fact that we are, there are concerns about chip shortages and chips. Silicon chips are what are core to a lot of our kind of technological functions in society at this point. So a firm can make a decision to do something different, right? We can also, either kind of make government policy or make government investments that can enhance resilience. So there's a lot of attention being paid right now in the food space to, are there bottlenecks, and particularly in the processing industry, are there particular bottlenecks? Is there, market power that has, and other types of power that certain firms have, and so when those bottlenecks are created, when one processing plant shuts down, it might be huge, and it might be processing so many hogs or so much of a particular product that one processing facility shut down or decreasing its processing speed has a very large impact. If we distribute our production, there's this discussion, if we distribute our production and invest more in local and regional food systems, can that help so that if one pathway for processing is shut down, that there are other options that can kind of absorb some of that? Now that is really can be can enhance resilience during hard times like this. But then the flip side, the reason that hadn't happened previously is there's this concern that that's not particularly efficient to do during good times. And so there's this really this kind of major discussion happening of where do you make those investments if you have kind of a limited budget, or you have to decide kind of where to invest. How do you do that to really enhance resilience the most?
Yeah. Okay. So One of the questions on here, which I find really interesting, and I ask myself as well, is, this question from Blake Myers, how do we cut through the supply chain issues and go directly to the producer? Would buying a quarter of the cow from a farmer be more of the norm in the future? So is one element of resilience people individually, taking more command of their own food supply, in the sense that rather than going to, Kroger or Giant Eagle and buying it, they should be going straight to the producer and buying it? Are we going to see more of that as a quote unquote resilience or adaptation to the COVID supply chains? I guess, why is that, or isn't that a sort of a response that's going to happen more broadly?
I think you will see some of that. I mean, ultimately, we don't all grow our own food because we don't all, I don't know about you, but I work full time as a professor. I don't have time to grow my own food, and I'm not very good at it. I'm much better at this kind of stuff than I am at actually producing the food that I'm talking about, right? And so some people might choose to interact more directly with producers, or to spend more time, right? There's an additional transaction cost that is involved in that, right? That kind of covers all of the costs that are associated with, having that individual transaction with a producer. When we go to a grocery store, we have this kind of one-stop shopping, right? Where we can buy all different kinds of products. Now, in other cultures, outside of the United States, that one-stop shopping is much less common. It might be that you go to a butcher, you go to a bakery, et cetera. And so you might already have kind of more of that is baked into your approach. So I do think there might be some of that, but ultimately the higher transaction costs associated with that and a lower convenience of doing that are going to, I think, limit it as a large scale strategy for consumers.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. There were a lot of questions also about the fruits and vegetables earlier on in your presentation. I'm going to start with the one here by Alba Collart regarding the graph showing the annual percentage change in retail price for fruits and vegetables. Could you elaborate on why you think the changes in the fruit graphs differ from those of the fresh vegetables? There's a few other questions on there that we'll come to as well on the fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, so my guess is that fruits tend to be not overall, to be more shelf stable than a lot of other, not shelf stable, but they tend to last longer, right? Apples can be stored for a much longer period. I don't think we see the same kind of rate of spoilage probably over time as quick for fruits as we do for vegetables. I also think this could have to do maybe with kids. We often see that that parents buy a lot of fruits. Kids are not as into vegetables as they are into fruits. So this could have to do something with folks, buying more fruits for their kids, and the kind of location of kids being different during this time, just because of the closures of daycare and schools. Maybe they're not eating food at school as much, and that is kind of shifting some of those purchasing patterns in ways that are affecting inflation.
And a simple related question from, well, maybe not simple, I don't know, from Marcus McCartney, it was in the chat feature, just really actually, how do you categorize, or what qualifies as a fruit? For example, I categorize tomatoes, peppers, squash, etc. as fruits. Are those, it's maybe straightforward, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd have to look. I'm pretty sure, though, that this is not the scientific categorization of fruits and vegetables, which would correspond, Marcus, I think, with your definition, but with kind of the way that we think of them in terms of retail categories. So I think that tomatoes, peppers, and squash would be considered vegetables for the purposes of this. But I'd have to double check to check how the USDA categorized it. And I do encourage you, the slides will be made available, and I encourage you, if you'd like to kind of dig into some of this, all the hyperlinks are available to my sources, so you can check that definition yourself if you would like.
So I can't avoid a question from our colleague Ian Sheldon, because he's asked a couple of them now, but I'm going to take the second one because I think it relates fairly closely to the conversation here, which is essentially, I mean, as I read his question, Ian, you can correct me later, is so the argument there is that, probably monetary policy doesn't affect food price. So he's sort of arguing, I think, that, and it's consistent with your point, I think, that really it's these COVID related supply, et cetera, other things are really what's affecting food prices, and it may have less to do with the general inflationary trends in the economy.
I think that's a great point. I maybe Ian will address that in his own in his own talk. I'm going to kick it back to Ian because I know Ian's going to give a talk a little later this year, kind of on trade, and also Mark is going to give a talk kind of on general inflation trends, which might kind of give his answer to this question as well. I certainly, think that because foods are a necessity, right? We won't see purchasing behavior affected as significantly for food as we would for other types of goods. I think due to monetary policy. But that would be my answer. And I hope that some of our other speakers throughout the series will also, I wasn't intending to focus a lot on the Fed and monetary policy. It's not my area of expertise, but I hope some of our other speakers can help answer some of those questions as well throughout our series.
Yeah, so kind of as a final question, broadly, since we're at a university, and I really appreciate this from Dr. Nadiradze, what are the research directions? What do we need to do to address some of these questions in the food sector? So basically the question is, what are the most important research and scientific issues that researchers here at CFAS should be dealing with or should be thinking about in order to try to help with the questions that have been raised with higher food prices? What are the big issues in your mind that we should be looking at?
Well, I think they've already been highlighted by some of the folks' questions, right? So one would be this question of resilience. It's, what is resilience? What does it take for the food system to be resilient? How can we both recover right now, but also prepare for future disasters and disruptions? And I actually have some work related to food system resilience and food system disaster and disruptions with folks here at Ohio State, Shoshana Inwood in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, Jill Clark in the Glenn College of Public Affairs, and we're actually working with someone at Ohio Emergency Management, which is the agency that responds to emergencies in the state of Ohio, to kind of look at some of those questions. And so there's the kind of short-term and the long-term question about resilience. Then I think also, folks have brought up this idea about wages and about equity in the food system. And I, mentioned this idea about the future of work if we do see increasing automation. And so I think these are very key questions that we need to be working on right now. So really looking at, if as a society, we would like to, think about and ultimately increase wages to a livable level, then how can we do that? What does that mean for our food prices? And what are the strategies that we can have to mitigate some of the negative impacts that might be faced kind of because of that? And that, requires some intensive study and some creativity. And then also, what are people going to do in the future? What does work look like, and how is it different from now, and how can we enable people to get there? And it's not as simple, I think, as just, oh, here's a retraining program, right? Because ultimately, when people change what work they're in, and I think my colleague Margaret Jadlowski will talk about this, when she gives her presentation on labor later in this series, there's this, your identity is in part related to what you do for work. I think especially that's true culturally and socially in the United States. And so when we change what we do for work, that really profoundly affects how we think about ourselves. And that's a dramatic and challenging shift for any person. And then add the stressors of COVID, and it's an even more challenging thing to think about.
Well, thanks, Zoe. We've come to the end of our hour. I really appreciate your willingness to take on this really difficult and complicated topic, right at the start of our webinar series. And it's a fantastic overview of the, these price increase issues in the food sector. And I really appreciate your willingness to do that here. So thanks. You'll get a clap from me, but I assume everybody else out there is clapping as well. And we invite folks who are here with us still to attend the future webinars. We have one in 2 weeks with Dr. Simki Lee talking about commodity prices and what's going on in those markets. And after that, a number of other webinars, I should say, that Zoe talked about, from Many people in our department talking about sort of the general inflationary trends, what's going on with trade, what's going on in energy markets, what's going on in labor markets, et cetera. So hopefully you can join us for that. We have that in the chat feature where you can go to get information on those future webinars. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you being here today.